the last king of a forgotten people. The winter wind howled through the abandoned halls of Coranthos, carrying with it the scent of snow and the whisper of endings. King Valus III sat alone in his throne room, a vast chamber that had once echoed with the voices of 500 courtiers, but now held only silence and shadows. The tapestries depicting the glory of his ancestors hung tattered on the walls, their colours faded to ghost-pale blues and greys. He was 47 years old, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would be the last of his line. The kingdom of Coranthos had endured for 8 centuries, carved from the mountains by his ancestor, King Morthon I, in the year 1193. For generations, the people of Coranthos had thrived in their mountain stronghold, protected by peaks that reached 3,000 meters into the sky, and valleys where silver birch forests grew thick as walls. They had numbered nearly 60,000 souls at their height during the reign of King Aldrich V in the 15th century, when the mines had run rich with copper and iron, and merchants from 7 kingdoms had climbed the treacherous passes to trade. But that was before the Great Drought of 1612, which lasted 11 years and turned the mountain streams to dust. It was before the plague of 1647, which took 1/3 of the population in a single terrible summer. It was before the slow, inexorable abandonment that followed, as families packed their belongings onto carts and made the long journey down from the mountains to seek easier lives in the lowland kingdoms. Valus rose from his throne, his joints protesting the cold that had seeped into the stone. He was a tall man, lean from years of meagre harvests, with hair that had turned silver before he reached 40. His robes, once purple and trimmed with ermine, were now patched and faded, mended by his own hands, because there were no longer any servants to do such work. He walked to the window, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, and looked out over his kingdom. Coranthos spread below him in the dying light, a city of 10,000 buildings clinging to the mountainside, and perhaps 200 of them still occupied. Smoke rose from only 17 chimneys that he could count. The great market square, which had once hosted 3,000 traders every week, stood empty, its cobblestones cracked and overgrown with mountain grass. The Temple of the 7 Stars, built in 1321, stood with its doors hanging open, its priests long since departed for more populated lands. He could remember when there had been children playing in those streets. That was 20 years ago, when the population had still numbered in the thousands. Now there were fewer than 300 people left in all of Coranthos, most of them elderly, all of them stubborn. They had chosen to remain, as he had, because this was their home, and they would not abandon it, even as it crumbled around them. A knock came at the door, 3 soft taps that barely disturbed the silence. Valus turned from the window. "Enter!" he called, his voice rougher than he remembered it being in his youth. The door creaked open, and Mireth stepped inside. She was 61 years old, the daughter of a nobleman who had died 30 years past, and she had appointed herself as the king's last advisor, though he had never formally given her the title. Her grey hair was bound in a simple braid, and she wore the practical woolen dress of a mountain woman, not the silks she might have worn in better days. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a slight bow, "I have completed the census you requested." Valus gestured for her to approach, and she crossed the throne room, her footsteps joining his in their lonely echo. She carried a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, and she opened it with careful hands. 287 souls remain in Corinthos, she read. 163 are over the age of 50. 42 are between 30 and 50. 79 are between 10 and 30. 3 are under the age of 10. 3 children. Vilas felt something twist in his chest. When he had been crowned at 23, following the death of his father, King Vilas II, there had been hundreds of children in the city. He had believed then that he would have heirs, that he would marry and father sons and daughters who would carry on the line. But the young women had left with their families, seeking better prospects in the lowlands, and he had never found love among those who remained. "The winter stores?" he asked. "Sufficient for perhaps 5 months, if we ration carefully," Mireth replied. The harvest was poor again this year. The terraced fields on the eastern slope produced less than 1/4 of what they did 20 years ago. "The soil is exhausted, Your Majesty." "And the livestock?" 47 goats, 12 sheep, 8 pigs, and perhaps 24 chickens scattered among the households. Not enough to sustain us through another hard winter, should spring fail to come. Vilas nodded slowly. He had known all of this, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it a weight that mere knowledge could not. "Thank you, Mireth. You may go." She hesitated at the door. "Your Majesty, there is one other matter. A delegation arrived this afternoon from Valderam. They wish to speak with you." Valderam. The name stirred memories of childhood lessons, of maps spread across tables showing the kingdoms of the lowlands. Valderam was one of the largest, with a population that numbered over 400,000, with cities of 50,000 souls or more. Its king, Theodoric IX, ruled from a palace that was said to have 1,000 rooms. "What do they want?" Vilas asked, though he suspected he already knew. "They did not say, Your Majesty, but their leader, a man named Lord Casimir, carries the seal of King Theodoric. I believe it is a formal embassy." "Send them to me in the morning," Vilas said. "Let them rest tonight in whatever accommodations we can provide." After Mireth departed, Vilas remained at the window, watching as darkness fell over Corinthos. The stars emerged, brilliant and cold, the same stars his ancestors had watched for 800 years. He thought of King Morthon I, who had built this kingdom from nothing, who had carved terraces into the mountainside and raised walls of stone that had stood for centuries. He thought of all the kings who had come after, 43 of them across 26 generations, each one believing that their kingdom would endure forever. He was the 44th, and he would be the last. Morning came grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the peaks like shrouds. Vilas dressed in his finest remaining robes, a deep blue velvet that had belonged to his grandfather, King Aldrich VII. The gold thread that had once decorated the hem had been picked away years ago, and sold to buy grain during a particularly harsh winter, but the robe still retained some measure of dignity. He placed the crown of Corinthos on his head, a simple circlet of silver set with 7 small sapphires, one for each of the original clans that had founded the kingdom. The throne room had been prepared as best as could be managed. Mireth and 3 others, the last of what had once been a royal household of 150 servants, had swept the floors and lit braziers to drive away some of the chill. The tapestries had been straightened, though nothing could hide their threadbare condition. It would have to be enough. Lord Casimir arrived precisely at the 9th hour, announced by a knock at the great doors. He entered with 2 companions, all 3 dressed in the rich clothing of Valdorum nobility, their cloaks lined with fur, their boots barely touched by the mud of the mountain paths. Casimir himself was perhaps 40 years old, with a neat beard and shrewd eyes that took in every detail of the decaying throne room. "Your Majesty," Casimir said, offering a bow that was correct but minimal, "I bring greetings from King Theodoric the Ninth of Valdorum, Lord of the 7 Rivers, protector of the eastern marches." Valus inclined his head. "You are welcome in Coranthos, Lord Casimir. Please, speak your purpose." Casimir stepped forward, producing a scroll sealed with red wax. "King Theodoric has asked me to present you with a proposal, Your Majesty, a solution to the difficulties that have befallen your kingdom." "And what solution would that be?" "Annexation," Casimir said simply. "Coranthos would become a province of Valdorum. Your people would receive protection, supplies, and the full support of our kingdom. The lands of Coranthos would be integrated into our holdings, and your subjects would become citizens of Valdorum with all the rights and privileges that entails." Valus felt his hands tighten on the arms of his throne. He had expected this, yet hearing it spoken aloud still struck like a blow. And what of the crown of Coranthos? What of our independence, maintained for 8 centuries? "King Theodoric is a generous man," Casimir continued, his voice smooth as oil. "He understands the pride of ancient lineages. He would grant you a manor in the lowlands, a pension of 3,000 gold marks per year, and a position as an advisor to the royal court. You would live in comfort for the remainder of your days, Your Majesty." "As a pensioner," Valus said quietly, "as a former king of a forgotten kingdom, kept like a curiosity at court." Casimir had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "The alternative, Your Majesty, is to watch your kingdom die. In 5 years, perhaps 10 at most, there will be no one left in these mountains. Coranthos will become a ruin, a place for shepherds to shelter their flocks from storms. Your 800 years of history will fade to legend, and then to nothing at all." The truth of it burned. Valus looked past Casimir to the empty spaces of his throne room, to the places where courtiers had once stood. He thought of the census. 287 people, most of them old, only 3 children among them. He thought of the exhausted soil, the depleted mines, the slow, inevitable slide toward emptiness. "How long do I have to consider this proposal?" he asked. "King Theodoric would appreciate an answer within 30 days, Casimir replied. "I and my companions will remain in Coranthos during that time, should you have questions or wish to discuss terms." After the delegation departed, Valus walked through his city. He descended the 700 steps from the palace to the lower terraces, passing houses that stood empty and dark. Here and there he saw faces at windows, old men and women who had been born in Coranthos and would die here, regardless of what he decided. They watched him with eyes that held no judgment, only a sad understanding. He found himself at the Temple of the 7 Stars, its doors still hanging open as they had for years. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of stone and age. The great statue of Elthera, the mother goddess of the mountain people, still stood before the altar, though her face had been worn smooth by 800 years of prayers and offerings. Valus knelt before her, his knees protesting against the cold floor. "I do not know what to do," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty temple. If I accept, Caranthos ends, but our people may survive and find new lives in the lowlands. If I refuse, I preserve our independence for a few more years, but condemn those who remain to hardship and poverty until they too are forced to leave or die. The goddess did not answer, of course. She had not answered prayers in Caranthos for many years, if she ever truly had, but kneeling there in the silence, Veles felt a strange clarity settle over him. He rose and walked to the temple's eastern window, which looked out over the terraced fields where his ancestors had grown barley and wheat for 8 centuries. The fields were empty now, covered in snow, but he could imagine them as they had been in the old paintings, golden with grain, dotted with workers singing as they harvested. He could imagine the city as it had been, alive and vibrant, full of voices and laughter and the ordinary bustle of human life. That Caranthos was gone, and it would not return, no matter what choice he made. But perhaps something could be preserved, not the kingdom itself, but the memory of it, the knowledge of what his people had built and achieved in these mountains across 800 years. Veles turned from the window and walked back through the city, his mind working. By the time he reached the palace, he knew what he would do. He found Mirith in the library, one of the few rooms still kept warm, where she was carefully copying records into new books before the old ones crumbled entirely to dust. "Mirith," he said, "I need you to gather everyone, every soul remaining in Caranthos. Tell them I will address them 3 days from now in the market square at midday." She looked up from her work, surprise evident on her face. "Everyone, Your Majesty?" "Yes, all 287 of us. It is time we made a decision together about the future of our kingdom." 3 days later, they gathered as he had requested. The market square, which had once held 3,000 traders, now held fewer than 300 people, but they filled it with their presence nonetheless. Old men leaning on canes, women wrapped in shawls against the cold, a handful of younger people who had chosen to stay despite everything, and 3 children who watched with solemn eyes. Veles stood on the steps of the old merchant hall and looked at his people, the last remnant of a kingdom that had endured for 800 years. He did not wear his crown. He had left it in the palace, on the throne where it had rested for so many generations. "My people," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "you know why I have called you here. The kingdom of Valdorum has offered us annexation. They offer safety, supplies, and new lives in the lowlands. They offer us an end to our struggles and our slow fading." He paused, letting the words settle. "I cannot make this decision alone. Caranthos belongs to all of us, to every person who has chosen to remain when others left, to every soul who loves these mountains despite their harshness. So I ask you now, what shall we do? Shall we accept Valdorum's offer and end our kingdom, or shall we refuse and continue as we are for as long as we are able?" For a long moment no one spoke. Then an old man named Theron, who had been a blacksmith for 68 years, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice cracking with age, "I was born in Caranthos. My father was born here, and his father before him, going back 10 generations. But I am 83 years old, and I have no children, no grandchildren to carry on after me. What use is preserving a kingdom if there's no one to inherit it?" A woman named Yasmin, one of the few of middle years who remained, spoke next. "I stayed because this is my home. but my daughter deserves a chance at a real life, at a future with more than scraping by in empty halls. If accepting Valderum's offer gives her that chance, then I say we should take it." One by one, others spoke. Some argued for accepting, others for refusing. But as Valus listened, he heard a common thread in their words. They were tired. They had fought for years, for decades, to keep their kingdom alive, and they had watched it die by inches despite their efforts. They were ready to rest. When the last person had spoken, Vilas raised his hand for silence. "Then it is decided," he said. "In 30 days, when Lord Casimir asks for my answer, I will accept Valdorum's terms. Coranthos will cease to exist as an independent kingdom. But before that happens, we will ensure that we are not forgotten." He outlined his plan. They would spend the next 30 days creating a record of everything Coranthos had been. They would write down the names of every king, every significant event, every tradition and custom. They would copy the most important books from the library, create maps of the city and the kingdom, record the songs and stories that had been passed down through generations. This record would be presented to King Theodoric with one condition, that it be preserved in the royal library of Valderum, where scholars could study it and remember that Coranthos had existed and mattered. The work began the next morning and continued through 30 days of winter. Every person capable of holding a pen contributed. The children were taught the old songs so they could sing them for scribes to transcribe. Old craftsmen explained their techniques, which were recorded in careful detail. Mirith worked 18 hours each day, organizing and copying, her hands cramped and ink-stained, but never stopping. Vialis himself wrote the official history, sitting at his grandfather's desk in the palace library. He wrote of King Morthon I and the founding of the kingdom in 1193. He wrote of the golden years under King Aldric V, when Coranthos had been prosperous and proud. He wrote of the great drought and the plague, of the slow decline and the choosing to remain despite everything. He wrote it all in clear, precise language, determined that future generations would know the truth of what had been. On the 30th day, Lord Casimir returned to the throne room. Vilas stood waiting, not on the throne, but before it, surrounded by 36 chests containing the records his people had created. The crown of Coranthos rested on top of the largest chest. "Lord Casimir," Vilas said, "I accept King Theodoric's terms, with one addition. These chests contain the complete history and knowledge of Coranthos. They must be preserved in the royal library of Valdorum, and scholars must be granted access to study them. This is my only condition." Casimir looked at the chests, then at Bailey's. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "I will ensure it, Your Majesty. You have my word." 3 months later, on the first day of spring, Vilas walked one final time through the empty halls of the palace. The people of Coranthos had already departed, making their way down the mountain paths to begin new lives in Valdorum. He was the last, as was fitting, the last king of a forgotten people, closing the doors on 800 years of history. He did not look back as he descended the 700 steps for the final time. The kingdom of Coranthos would fade into memory, but it would not be forgotten entirely. Somewhere in the great library of Valdorum, scholars would read about the Mountain Kingdom and know that it had mattered, that it had existed, that for 8 centuries a people had carved out a life in the harsh peaks and called it home. And that would have to be enough. The final night of King Harold II. The wind howled across the ridge at Senlac Hill, like the breath of some ancient god, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of 1,000 dying fires. King Harold II of England stood alone in his command tent, the canvas walls snapping and billowing around him, like the sails of a ship caught in a storm. Outside, the sounds of his army preparing for sleep mingled with the groans of the wounded, creating a symphony of suffering that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. It was the 13th day of October in the year 1066, though to Harold it felt as if he had lived a dozen lifetimes in the span of 3 weeks. His reflection in the polished bronze mirror showed a man aged beyond his 44 years, his face carved with lines of exhaustion and worry, his once bright eyes now dulled by the weight of impossible choices. The crown of England sat heavy on his brow, though he had removed it hours ago and placed it on the small wooden table beside his sleeping pallet. In the flickering candlelight, it seemed less a symbol of power and more a golden shackle. He poured himself a cup of wine from the pitcher his squire had left, noting how his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, he told himself, but from the bone-deep weariness that came from fighting 2 major battles in the span of less than a month. First, there had been Stamford Bridge up in the north, where he had crushed the invasion of Harold Hardrada of Norway and his own treacherous brother Tostig. That victory should have been celebrated throughout the kingdom, sung about in mead halls for generations. Instead, Harold had barely allowed his men a single night's rest before force-marching them 240 miles south to face a new invader, William of Normandy. The Norman Duke had landed on the 28th of September, setting up camp at Pevensey, and then moving to Hastings, burning and pillaging the lands of Sussex as if he already owned them. Harold had arrived on Senlac Hill just that morning, the 14th of October, his army exhausted, depleted, and stretched to breaking point. Yet they had fought with the courage of lions, forming the legendary shield wall that had held against wave after wave of Norman cavalry and arrows. Harold walked to the entrance of his tent and pulled back the flap, looking out over the encampment. Thousands of cook fires dotted the hillside, each one surrounded by clusters of men trying to warm themselves against the October chill. These were his men, his people, farmers and thegns, housecarls and firds, men who had left their fields and families to answer their king's call. Many of them had marched with him from the north, their feet bloodied and blistered, their bodies pushed beyond human endurance. How could he ask them to do the impossible once more when the sun rose tomorrow? A figure approached through the darkness, and Harold recognized the gait of his brother Gurth, Earl of East Anglia. At 34 years old, Gurth was 10 years Harold's junior, with the same broad shoulders and strong jaw that marked the Godwinson line. Unlike Harold, however, Gurth's face still held some of the optimism of youth, though it was fading fast with each passing hour. "Brother," Gurth said, his voice low, "you should be resting. Tomorrow will be the hardest day of our lives." Harold managed a bitter smile. "Tomorrow will be the hardest day, or it will be the last day. I find I cannot sleep knowing which it might be." Gurth stepped into the tent, and Harold noticed he was not alone. Their youngest brother, Leofwine, Earl of Kent, followed behind. At about 32 years of age, Leofwine had always been the most cheerful of the 3 surviving Godwinson brothers, quick with the joke and quicker with the sword. Tonight, however, his usual smile was nowhere to be seen. We need to talk, Harold, Leofwine said, and there was an urgency in his voice that made Harold's stomach tighten. About tomorrow's battle. About our strategy. Harold gestured for them to sit, and the three brothers settled onto the campaign stools arranged around the small table. Harold poured wine for each of them, and for a moment they simply sat in silence. Three men who had grown up together, fought together, and now faced death together. "Speak plainly," Harold said. "What troubles you?" Girth leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Our position troubles me, Harold. We hold the high ground, yes, and our shield wall proved its worth today. But we are too few. We lost good men at Stamford Bridge, and we have had no time to gather reinforcements. William has fresh troops, rested horses, and the patience to wait us out." "We cannot wait," Harold said firmly. "Every day we remain here, William ravages more of my kingdom. Every village he burns, every field he destroys, weakens England. I will not allow that Norman bastard to carve up my lands while I sit on a hill and watch." "Then let us take a different approach," Leofwine interjected. "Fall back. Retreat to London. Gather every able-bodied man in the kingdom. Return with an army so large that William will have no choice but to board his ships and flee back to Normandy." Harold shook his head. The suggestion was not without merit. "And in the meantime, William consolidates his position. He builds fortifications. He brings more men from across the Channel. No, we must strike now, while he is still vulnerable. One decisive victory, and the Norman threat ends. Or one decisive defeat, and England falls," Girth said quietly. "Brother, I beg you, think of the kingdom. Think of your sons. If you fall tomorrow, who leads England? Your boys are too young, too inexperienced. The kingdom will tear itself apart." Harold felt anger flash through him, hot and sudden. "You think I do not know this? You think I have not lain awake every night since I took this cursed crown, knowing that every decision I make could doom the kingdom I swore to protect?" He took a breath, forcing himself to calm. "But I am the king. I am the anointed sovereign of England. If I run now, if I show weakness, every petty lord and ambitious earl will see it. The kingdom will not rally to a coward, it will devour one." The tent fell silent again, save for the distant sounds of the camp and the ever-present wind. Finally, Girth spoke again, and his voice was gentle. "No one would call you a coward, Harold. You have proven your courage 100 times over. You defeated the greatest Viking warrior of our age just 3 weeks ago. You have nothing left to prove." "Nothing except that I can keep my kingdom," Harold replied. He stood and walked back to the tent entrance, looking out at the fires again. "Do you know what I fear most? Not death, not defeat. I fear that in 100 years, in 1,000 years, people will look back at this moment and say that Harold Godwin's, the last true English king, threw away his kingdom because he was too proud or too stubborn to retreat. I fear being remembered as the man who lost England." Leofwine came to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then let us make sure that does not happen. Whether we fight tomorrow or whether we retreat, we face it together. 3 of us, as we always have." Harold turned to look at his younger brother, seeing the love and loyalty there, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You should both leave," he said suddenly. "Tonight, take horses and ride for London. Live to fight another day. If tomorrow goes badly, England will need you. Absolutely not, Girth said, standing up so quickly his stool toppled over. We are Godwinsons. We stand together, or we fall together. There is no other way. He is right, Leofwine added. Besides, who would protect your thick head if we were not there to guard your flanks? Despite everything, Harold smiled. You are both fools. We learned from the best, Girth said with a slight grin. The commotion outside the tent drew their attention. Harold heard raised voices, and then his chamberlain appeared at the entrance, looking flustered. My lord king, forgive the interruption, but there is a messenger from the Norman camp. He says Duke William wishes to parley. Harold exchanged glances with his brothers. At this hour? What game is William playing? Perhaps he seeks terms of surrender, Leofwine suggested hopefully. Or perhaps he seeks to spy on our defences, Girth countered. Harold made his decision quickly. Bring him in under guard and search him thoroughly for weapons. A few minutes later, a Norman knight was escorted into the tent by 4 of Harold's housecarls, their axes held ready. The knight was young, perhaps 25 years old, with the bearing of minor nobility. He bowed stiffly to Harold. My lord king, he said in accented English, I bring greetings from William, Duke of Normandy, rightful King of England. Harold felt his jaw clench at the title, but he kept his voice level. Duke William has no right to the English crown. It was given to me by King Edward on his deathbed, and confirmed by the Witan. Whatever message you bring, deliver it quickly. The knight's composure wavered slightly under Harold's hard stare, but he pressed on. My Lord Duke wishes you to know that he takes no pleasure in the bloodshed that occurred today. He proposes a solution that would prevent further loss of life on both sides. I am listening, Harold said, though he could already guess what was coming. Duke William asks that you acknowledge his rightful claim to the throne of England. In return, he would grant you the earldom of Wessex to hold as his vassal. Your brothers would retain their lands as well. All he asks is your oath of fealty and the crown that rightfully belongs to him. The tent erupted. Girth started forward, his hand on his sword, while Leofwine let out a stream of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Harold held up a hand, and his brothers reluctantly fell silent, though their fury was palpable. Harold studied the young knight carefully, seeing the nervousness behind his brave facade. Tell me, what is your name? I am Robert Fitzwimmark, my lord, vassal of Duke William. Well then, Robert Fitzwimmark, I will give you an answer to carry back to your duke. Are you prepared to remember my words exactly? I am, my lord. Harold drew himself up to his full height, and in that moment he looked every inch the warrior king. Tell William of Normandy that Harold, by the grace of God, King of England, rejects his offer with a contempt it deserves. Tell him that Edward the Confessor granted me this crown on his deathbed, as was his right as the anointed king. Tell him that the nobles and bishops of England confirmed my kingship, as was their right as according to English law. Tell him that any oath I may have sworn to him years ago was given under duress when I was his prisoner, and such oaths are void in the eyes of God and man. He paused, letting his words sink in. And tell him this, Robert Fitzwimmark, tomorrow when the sun rises, we will settle this matter the only way it can be settled, by the sword and the will of God. If William wants the crown of England, he can pry it from my cold, dead hands. The Norman knight had gone pale, but he nodded. "I will deliver your message, my lord." "One more thing," Harold added, his voice softening slightly. "Tell your duke that I respect his courage in crossing the channel with his army. Tell him that in another world, another time, we might have been friends rather than enemies. But tell him also that I will defend my kingdom with every breath in my body, and that the men who stand with me are the bravest in the world. If he seeks glory through conquest, he will find it tomorrow, but he may also find his death." Robert bowed again and was escorted from the tent. As soon as he was gone, Leofwine let out a long breath. "Well, that tears it. No turning back now." "There is never any turning back," Harold said quietly. He returned to his stool and sat heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 44 years. William would never have let me keep Wessex. The moment I bent the knee, I would have become a puppet, and eventually he would have found some excuse to remove me. Better to die a king than live as a slave. Gurth poured himself more wine and drank deeply. "Then let us talk strategy for tomorrow. William will not make the same mistakes twice. Today he threw his cavalry at our shield wall, and it broke against us like waves on a cliff. Tomorrow he will be more cunning. He will use his archers more effectively," Leofwine predicted. "Today they shot too high, and their arrows passed over our shield wall. Tomorrow they will aim lower, try to hit our legs, and break our formation." Harold nodded. "We need to reinforce the flanks. That is where our line is weakest, and we need to maintain discipline. Today, some of our men broke formation to chase retreating Normans and were cut down. Tomorrow, no one leaves the shield wall without my direct order." They talked long into the night, planning positions and contingencies, discussing which commanders should be placed where, which units were still fresh enough to hold critical positions. It was past midnight when Gurth and Leofwine finally left to check on their own men and get a few hours of sleep. Harold remained in his tent, knowing that sleep would not come for him. Instead, he pulled out a piece of parchment and a quill, intending to write letters to his sons in case tomorrow went badly. But as he sat there, staring at the blank page, he found he could not find the words. What did you say to children who might never see their father again? How did you comfort them when you were about to gamble their entire future on a single day's battle? He thought of his eldest son, Godwin, barely 18 years old and eager to prove himself. Harold had sent him to the West Country to raise more troops, a task that would keep him safe from tomorrow's battle, but would also fill him with guilt if his father fell. His other sons were even younger, boys who should be learning to hunt and hawk, not preparing to defend a kingdom against Norman invaders. And then there was Edith Swanneck, his handfast wife of more than 20 years, the mother of his children, the woman who knew him better than anyone. He had sent her away to safety weeks ago, and she had gone reluctantly, making him promise to come back to her. It was a promise he might not be able to keep. A noise outside his tent made him look up. He reached for his sword, but then he heard a familiar voice asking permission to enter. "Come," Harold called, and his most trusted advisor, Ansgar the Staller, ducked into the tent. Ansgar was an old warrior, well past 60 years of age, with more scars than hairs on his head. He had served Harold's father, Earl Godwin, and had been a steady presence at Harold's side for decades. Now, he looked at his king with concern. "You should sleep, my lord. You will need your strength tomorrow." "I will sleep when this is over," Harold replied, one way or another. Ansgar sat down uninvited, which was one of the privileges of long friendship. I was at the north end of the line today. I saw the fighting there. Our men held like champions. They did, Harold agreed. But will they hold tomorrow, and the day after that, if it comes to it? We cannot sustain a prolonged battle, Ansgar. William can afford to be patient. We cannot. Then we break him tomorrow, Ansgar said simply. We hold the shield wall until his men are exhausted, and then we push forward and drive them into the sea. It can be done. I have seen you do the impossible before. Harold smiled sadly. Have I? Sometimes I wonder if everything I have achieved has just been luck and timing. Good men following a mediocre king, because there was no better option. Ansgar's response was swift and sharp. That is exhaustion talking, and I will not hear it. You are the finest warrior and the wisest leader I have ever known. Your father would be proud of the man you have become, and the king you are. He leaned forward, his old eyes fierce. Tomorrow, when you stand before that shield wall and address the men, they need to see strength. They need to see certainty. Can you give them that? Harold met his old friend's gaze and found his resolve hardening. Yes, I can give them that. Good. Ansgar stood to leave, but paused at the tent entrance. My lord, I have served 3 kings in my life. Edward was holy but weak. Your father was strong but too ambitious. You're the balance between them. The king England needs. Whatever happens tomorrow, you have been worthy of the crown. Never doubt that. After Ansgar left, Harold finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was coming. Tomorrow would indeed be the hardest day. The day that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of his entire people. The English had been invaded before by Romans and Vikings and Danes, but always they had endured, absorbing the conquerors and emerging stronger. But the Normans were different. If William won tomorrow, he would not integrate into English society. He would replace it, bringing his own language, his own laws, his own ways. The England that Harold knew and loved would cease to exist. He thought about the country he had sworn to protect. He thought about the villages and farms, the monasteries and churches, the ancient forests and rolling hills. He thought about the people, hard-working and proud, who had chosen him to lead them. They deserved better than this, better than a king who had led them into a battle they might not win. But there was no time for regret now. There was only tomorrow, and the slim hope that courage and determination might overcome superior numbers and fresh troops. Harold finally laid down on his pallet, not bothering to remove his armor. He stared up at the canvas ceiling of his tent, watching shadows dance in the candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and he wondered if it was an omen. In Norse mythology, wolves were creatures of destruction and endings. Perhaps it was fitting. His hand moved to touch the small wooden cross that hung around his neck, a gift from his mother many years ago. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage, for himself and his brothers, for his men who would stand with him tomorrow, for the kingdom he loved more than his own life. As the candle burned lower, Harold's thoughts drifted to the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, Edward the Confessor had still been alive, and Harold had been the most powerful earl in England, but still just a subject. Then Edward had died, leaving no direct heir, and the Wetan had chosen Harold to succeed him. It had been the greatest honour of his life. and perhaps the greatest curse. He thought about William of Normandy, waiting in his own tent, perhaps a mile away. The Norman Duke was younger than Harold, only 39 years old, but he had been hardened by a lifetime of warfare. William had fought his own vassals, neighbouring lords, and even the King of France. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly convinced of his divine right to the English throne. In William's mind, Harold was nothing but an oath-breaker and a usurper, a jumped-up earl who had stolen what rightfully belonged to Normandy. The truth was more complicated, as truth always was. Harold had indeed sworn an oath to William years ago, when he had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast and taken into William's custody. But that oath had been given under duress, extracted by a man who held Harold's life in his hands. More importantly, it had been superseded by Edward's deathbed designation and the Witan's confirmation. English law was clear. The crown could not be promised away to foreigners without the consent of the kingdom's nobles. William's claim was built on sand, but William did not care about English law or English customs. He had the backing of the Pope, who had sent him a consecrated banner to carry into battle. He had the support of adventurers and mercenaries from across Europe, drawn by promises of English land and wealth, and he had a burning ambition that would not be satisfied with anything less than total victory. Harold's eyes grew heavy despite his racing thoughts. He could not afford to sleep deeply, not with battle coming at dawn, but perhaps he could rest for an hour or two. He let his eyes close, the sounds of the camp fading into a distant murmur. In his dreams, he was young again, fighting alongside his father against the tyranny of Earl Godwin's enemies. He was at Stamford Bridge, watching Harold Hardrada fall, and knowing that the Viking age was finally over. He was in Westminster Abbey, feeling the crown placed upon his head, and the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. And then he was here, on Senlac Hill, watching the sun rise on the 15th of October in the year 1066. The final day of King Harold II of England, the forgotten Ice King of the North. In the far reaches of the world, where the auroras painted the sky in ribbons of emerald and violet, there existed a kingdom that time itself seemed reluctant to remember. The land stretched across frozen tundras and mountains of crystalline ice that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 dancing prisms. This was the domain of Iscaran the Pale, a ruler whose name had been whispered in awe and terror for generations, though now those whispers had faded into the howling winds that swept across his desolate realm. Iscaran had not always been forgotten. Once, his kingdom of Norvengard had been a jewel among the northern territories, a place where artisans crafted sculptures from ice that never melted, and where merchants travelled from distant lands to trade in furs so white they seemed spun from clouds. The capital city, Crystal Haven, had risen from the permafrost like a crown of frozen stars, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if in defiance of the harsh climate that sought to crush all life beneath its weight. In those days, Iscaran had been called the Just, the Wise, the Guardian of the Eternal Winter. His people had loved him, for he had brought prosperity to a land where survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. But that was before the curse, before the long silence, before the world turned its back on the Ice King and his frozen domain. Now, 3 centuries after his disappearance from the annals of history, Iscaran sat alone in his throne room, a vast chamber carved from a single glacier that had stood for millennia. The throne itself was a masterwork of nature and magic combined, formed from ice that blazed with an inner light, neither warm nor cold, but something in between, something that existed outside the normal laws of temperature and time. The Ice King's appearance reflected the centuries of isolation that had consumed him. His hair, once golden like the brief summer sun that graced these lands, had turned to pure white, flowing past his shoulders in waves that seemed to move with a wind that wasn't there. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of ancient ice, pale blue veins visible beneath the surface, like rivers frozen in time. His eyes, however, remained unchanged, a deep blue that held the color of the deepest ocean, still sharp and aware despite the weight of 300 years of solitude. He wore robes of white fur and silver thread, garments that had not aged because nothing in his kingdom aged anymore, suspended as it was in a moment that refused to end. Iskaran rose from his throne, his movements fluid despite the ages he had sat there. He walked to one of the great windows that lined the throne room, each pane made from ice so clear it might have been glass, had glass been able to withstand the bitter cold that was the natural state of Norvengard. Beyond the window stretched his kingdom, a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible emptiness. The city of Crystal Haven spread below him, its buildings intact, its streets unmarked by the passage of time, but utterly devoid of life. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices carried on the wind. The marketplace where thousands had once bartered and laughed now stood silent, stalls still arranged as they had been on that day. 3 centuries passed when everything had changed. The Ice King pressed one pale hand against the window, and frost bloomed from his fingertips in intricate patterns that resembled nothing so much as memories given form. He could see them there in the frost. His wife, Alara, her dark hair a stark contrast to the whiteness of their world, her laughter bright enough to warm even the coldest winter day. Their daughter, Freya, barely 10 winters old when the curse had fallen, her small hands always cold despite the furs they wrapped her in, her smile capable of melting his heart in ways the endless winter never could. His advisors, his guards, his subjects, all of them preserved in these frost memories, forever young, forever lost. The curse had come without warning, as such things often do. Iskaran had been a just ruler, perhaps too just for the liking of some. He had refused the demands of the witch lords of the eastern wastes, a cabal of sorcerers who had sought to use Norvengard as a staging ground for their conquest of the southern kingdoms. When they came with their armies of ice wraiths and frost giants, Iskaran had stood against them with his own magic, for the rulers of Norvengard had always possessed a connection to the winter, an ability to call upon the cold itself as both weapon and shield. The battle had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, the sky itself torn apart by competing magics. Iskaran had proven stronger than the witch lords anticipated. One by one, he had shattered their armies, breaking the ice wraiths back into the formless cold from which they came, sending the frost giants fleeing back to their mountain caves. On the 7th day, as victory seemed certain, the witch lords had played their final desperate card. They had combined their remaining power into a single curse, not of destruction, but of isolation, not meant to kill, but to remove Norvengard from the world entirely. The curse had struck like a wave of invisible force, washing over the kingdom in an instant. Iskarin had felt it the moment it took hold. A sensation like being encased in amber, like being caught between one heartbeat and the next. Every living thing in Norvengard had been frozen, not in ice, but in time itself. His people had simply stopped, caught mid-step, mid-word, mid-breath. Children remained suspended in the act of throwing snowballs. Merchants held coins that would never complete their journey from hand to hand. His wife and daughter, who had been standing beside him on the palace balcony, became as still as statues carved from flesh. But Iskarin himself had been spared this fate, and that had been the cruelest part of the curse. As the ruler, as the one who wielded the magic of winter, he remained conscious, aware, alive in a way his subjects were not. He could move, could think, could feel, and feeling was the torture of it. The Witch Lords had ensured he would remain awake to witness his failure, to spend eternity among his frozen people, unable to break the curse, unable to save them, unable even to join them in their timeless sleep. The first century had been the hardest. Iskarin had tried everything within his considerable power to break the curse. He had pored over every scroll in the royal library, had attempted counterspells and rituals that drained him to the point of collapse. He had climbed to the highest peak of the Frostspire Mountains and called out to the ancient spirits of winter, begging for their aid. He had descended into the deepest ice caves where the old magic was said to dwell, offering himself as a sacrifice if only his people could be freed. Nothing had worked. The curse was too powerful, too perfectly crafted. It was woven from the combined might of 7 Witch Lords, and it would require something equally powerful to undo it. The 2nd century had brought resignation. Iskarin had continued his studies, but with less urgency, knowing in his heart that he had exhausted every possibility. He had walked among his frozen subjects, speaking to them as if they could hear, telling them stories of what the world beyond their kingdom must be like now. He had maintained the city as best he could, using his magic to repair structures damaged by the occasional earthquake or storm. He had kept Crystal Haven pristine, a perfect snapshot of a moment 300 years past, because to let it decay would have been to admit defeat, to acknowledge that his people were truly lost. The 3rd century, the one in which he now found himself in its twilight years, had brought something unexpected. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of renewed purpose. Iskarin had begun to notice changes in the world beyond his kingdom. The aurora lights that danced above Norvengard had started to pulse with patterns he had never seen before. The winds that swept across the tundra carried whispers of words and languages that had not existed when his kingdom fell. Most significantly, he had felt tremors in the fabric of the curse itself, tiny fluctuations that suggested something in the wider world was changing, shifting in ways that might finally affect the magic that held Norvengard in its grip. It was this realization that had drawn him from his throne today. For the first time in 300 years, Iskarin felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of change. He turned from the window and led his way through the silent palace, his footsteps echoing in halls that had known no other sound for centuries. He passed through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, rulers of Norvengard stretching back 1,000 years, each one wearing the same crown of ice and silver that now rested on Iskarin's head. He wondered what they would think of him, whether they would see his survival as strength or his inability to break the curse as weakness. The palace library was his destination, a vast circular room with shelves that spiraled up toward a domed ceiling, painted with a map of the stars, as they had appeared on the night of Norvengard's finding. Iskeran had spent countless hours here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of his people, books on magic and history, scrolls detailing ancient rituals, tablets carved with the words of the first winter mages. All of it had been consumed and studied and memorized until he could recite entire volumes from memory. But today he sought something specific. Deep in the library's heart, protected by wards only he could pass, stood a single pedestal made from black ice quarried from the deepest part of the northern ocean. Upon this pedestal rested a book bound in white leather, its pages made from something that was neither paper nor parchment, but rather seemed to be frozen light given solid form. This was the Codex of Endless Winter, the most sacred text of Norvengard, written by the kingdom's founder, Vormak I, more than a millennium ago. Iskeran had consulted the Codex countless times over the centuries, but always he had focused on the sections dealing with magic, with spells and counter curses. Now, prompted by some instinct he could not name, he opened the book to its final pages, sections he had largely ignored because they dealt not with magic but with prophecy. Vormak had possessed the gift of foresight, and in his final years he had recorded visions of Norvengard's future, cryptic passages that spoke of trials and triumphs yet to come. The Ice King's fingers traced over words written in silver ink that shimmered even in the dim light of the library. Most of the prophecies he had read before and dismissed as either fulfilled or irrelevant, but one passage now caught his attention, a verse he had somehow overlooked in all his previous readings, or perhaps one that had not been visible until this moment. The ink seemed to glow brighter as his gaze fell upon it, and he read aloud, his voice the only sound in the silent library. When 3 centuries have turned, and the world beyond remembers not the crown of ice, when the guardian stands alone among his frozen children, and despair has worn the edges of his hope to nothing, then shall come the thaw. Not from within, but from without. Not through power, but through sacrifice. Not by magic, but by the one thing magic cannot touch. A heart unchanged by time. A love that refuses to forget. Iskeran read the passage 3 times, each word settling into his mind like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through his understanding. 3 centuries, the exact time that had passed, the world that had forgotten him. That much was certainly true. But the rest, this talk of thaw and sacrifice and unchanged hearts, what could it mean? He had sacrificed everything already. His kingdom, his family, his own existence beyond these frozen borders. What more could possibly be required? He closed the codex and stood in the silent library, feeling the weight of the prophecy settle over him, like a new burden added to the many he already carried. For 300 years, he had been reactive, trying to break a curse that had already been cast, attempting to undo what had been done. But prophecy suggested a different approach, not breaking the curse, but waiting for conditions to align, for the right moment when the magic might finally be vulnerable. The tremors he had felt in the curse, the changes in the aurora, the whispers on the wind, perhaps these were signs that the moment was approaching. Perhaps after 3 centuries of isolation, the world was finally ready to remember the Ice King of the North. But how would this remembering come? Who in the world beyond Norvengard even knew his kingdom had existed? The curse had not merely frozen his people in time, it had erased Norvengard from the memory of the world, removed it from maps and histories, caused those who had once known of the Northern Kingdom to forget it had ever been. Iskerin left the library and made his way to the highest tower of the palace, a journey that took him up a spiral staircase of 563 steps. He had counted them many times during his long isolation. At the top was an observatory, a room with walls of pure ice that allowed an unobstructed view of the lands in all directions. Here, he kept instruments that measured the flow of magic in the world, delicate constructs of crystal and silver that had been created by the greatest artificers of old Norvengard. The instruments were all active, their needles and dials moving in ways they had not moved for decades. The ley lines, the invisible rivers of magical energy that flowed through the world, were shifting. Something significant was happening beyond the borders of his frozen kingdom. Something that was affecting the very fabric of magic itself. Iskerin studied the readings, his mind working through possibilities. A great working of magic somewhere in the world? A natural phenomenon that affected the flow of energy? Or perhaps something related to the curse itself? Some external change that was weakening the bonds that held Norvengard outside of time? As he pondered these questions, movement in the distance caught his eye. Iskerin froze, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. There, at the very edge of his kingdom, where the frozen tundra met the slightly less frozen tundra that marked the border of Norvengard's curse, something was moving. For the first time in 300 years, something living had approached his kingdom. The Ice King pressed his face close to the wall, his breath forming patterns of frost on the already frozen surface. The figure was small, human-sized, wrapped in furs that marked them as a traveler from the south. They moved slowly, struggling against the wind and snow that was ever present at Norvengard's borders. As Iskerin watched, the figure stumbled, fell, rose again with evident difficulty. They were alone, which was strange. No one traveled the northern wastes alone, not if they valued their life. Yet here was someone doing exactly that, making their way directly toward the one place in the north that no one should have been able to find, that no one should have even remembered existed. A spark of something Iskerin had not felt in centuries flared in his chest. Excitement, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. He left the observatory at a run, descending the stairs 3 at a time, racing through the palace halls with a speed that belied his ancient nature. He had to reach the border, had to see who this impossible traveler was, had to understand why they had come. The prophecy's words echoed in his mind, not from within, but from without. The journey from the palace to the kingdom's border took Iskerin just under an hour, even moving at his fastest pace. He could have used his magic to transport himself instantly, but something made him want to make the journey on foot, to feel the reality of movement after so long sitting still. He passed through Crystal Haven, through streets where his frozen subjects stood eternal guard over shops and homes. He passed through the great gates of the city, massive constructs of iron and ice that had not been opened since the day the curse fell. He passed through the outlying villages, through farmlands where crops stood frozen in their fields, forever on the verge of harvest. Finally, he reached the border, marked by a line of standing stones that the first rulers of Norvengard had erected to define their territory. Beyond these stones, the world was muted, colors less vibrant, signs less clear. This was the edge of the curse, the boundary between frozen time and the world that continued to turn. Iskerin could cross this boundary if he wished, could walk out into the wider world, but he never had. To leave Norvengard would have been to abandon his people. That was something he could never do. The traveller had collapsed just beyond the standing stones, their body a small dark shape against the white snow. Iskerin could see their chest rising and falling. They were alive, but barely. Without thinking about the consequences, acting on an instinct that came from being a ruler who had once cared deeply for the welfare of others, Iskerin stepped across the boundary. The moment his foot touched the ground beyond the standing stones, he felt it, a rush of sensation, of time flowing around him instead of standing still. It was disorienting after centuries of timelessness, like stepping from a quiet room into a roaring river. He reached the traveller in moments and knelt beside them, carefully turning them over. The furs fell away from their face, and Iskerin found himself looking at a young woman, perhaps 25 winters old, with dark hair that reminded him painfully of Alara. Her lips were blue with cold, her skin pale from exposure, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a warm brown that seemed to hold depths of determination. "The Ice King," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I found you. I remembered. Those words, I remembered," struck Iskerin with the force of a physical blow. The curse made people forget. That was part of its power, part of what made it unbreakable. Yet here was someone who had remembered, who had somehow retained knowledge of Norvengard and its ruler, who had travelled across the frozen north alone to find a kingdom that should not have existed in anyone's memory. "Who are you?" Iskerin asked, his own voice rough from centuries of speaking only to himself. "How do you know of me?" The woman's eyes closed again, and for a moment Iskerin feared she had slipped into unconsciousness, or worse. But then she spoke, each word an effort. "My name is Astrid. My grandmother. She was from Norvengard. She escaped the day before the curse fell. She carried the memory, passed it down, told me to find you, told me you were waiting." Astrid's words rearranged Iskerin's understanding of everything. Someone had escaped the curse, had carried the memory of Norvengard out into the world, had kept that memory alive through generations until it reached this woman who had undertaken an impossible journey to find him. The prophecy's words came back to him, a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. He gathered Astrid into his arms, marveling at how light she was, how fragile compared to his own timeless existence. He carried her back across the boundary into Norvengard, and as he did, he felt something shift in the air around them. The curse, which had held absolute for 3 centuries, trembled. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Iskerin had spent so long studying the curse that he could feel every nuance of its structure. Bringing Astrid into Norvengard, bringing someone who remembered from the outside world, had created a crack in the magic, tiny but real. He took her to the palace, to his own chambers, where a fire burned that gave off no heat, but also required no fuel, one of the many paradoxes of his frozen kingdom. He laid her on his bed, the first person besides himself to occupy it in 300 years, and used his magic to slowly warm her, careful not to do it too quickly, lest the shock harm her. As colour returned to her face and her breathing steadied, Iskerin sat beside the bed and waited. It took several hours before Astrid fully woke. When she did, her eyes went wide as she took in her surroundings. The room of ice and silver, magical fire, and most of all, Iskerin himself, the legendary Ice King made real. She sat up slowly, and Iskerin noticed she was stronger than he had expected, recovering with a resilience that spoke of determination and preparation. "I'm really here," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Norvengard. It's exactly as my grandmother described it. The Jewel of the North, she called it. She said it was the most beautiful place in the world." "Your grandmother," Iskerin said gently. "What was her name?" "Senna," Astrid replied. "She was a weaver in Crystalhaven. She had gone to visit her sister in the Southern Territories, and was delayed by a storm. When she returned, she found nothing. At first she thought she had lost her way, that she had somehow ended up in the wrong place, but she knew these lands too well for that. Norvengard had simply vanished." Iskerin remembered Senna, though the memory was distant. She had been young when he had last seen her. Just a girl, really, learning her craft from her mother. That she had escaped the curse by pure chance seemed almost too perfect, as if fate itself had been laying groundwork for this moment 3 centuries in advance. "She tried to tell people," Astrid continued. "She went to the southern kingdoms, to the historians and the map makers, and told them about Norvengard, but no one believed her. They said there was no kingdom in the north, that she must have dreamed it or invented it. The curse had done its work well, but Senna refused to forget. She married, had children, and she told them all about the homeland she had lost. Most of them thought she was mad, or that she was telling stories. But my mother believed her, and she told me, and I believed too." "Why did you come?" Iskerin asked. "What made you attempt such a dangerous journey?" Astrid's expression grew serious. "Because my grandmother's final words before she died were about Norvengard. She made me promise that I would find it, that I would find you. She said the curse could only be broken by someone from outside who remembered, and that 3 centuries would pass before the time was right. She said..." Astrid paused, as if unsure whether to continue. "Say it," Iskerin urged. "She said that you had been waiting alone all this time, that you had never stopped trying to save your people, and that you deserved to know someone still remembered, even if nothing could be done." The Ice King felt something crack inside himself, a different kind of breaking than the magical tremor in the curse. This was an emotional rupture, the wall he had built around his heart over centuries of isolation suddenly crumbling. Tears formed in his eyes, the first he had shed in 200 years, and they froze on his cheeks as they fell, tiny diamonds of ice that caught the light and sparkled. "I have waited," he said softly, "and I have tried everything, but I could never find the key to breaking the curse." Astrid reached out and took his hand, and Iskerin was shocked by the warmth of her touch, by the reminder of what living flesh felt like. "Show me your kingdom," she said. "Show me the people my grandmother loved, even if we cannot save them. Let me see what she remembered so clearly." And so Iskerin led Astrid through Norvengard, showing her Crystalhaven in all its frozen glory, introducing her to his subjects who stood like statues throughout the city. He showed her the marketplace where her grandmother would have worked, the weaver's district with its looms still threaded with half-finished tapestries. He showed her the palace gardens where ice flowers bloomed eternal, never wilting, never growing, caught forever in their peak beauty. He showed her his family, Ilara and Freya, still standing on the balcony where they had been when the curse fell, and Astrid wept for them, tears that marked the first real grieving Iskerin had witnessed for his lost kingdom in all the long centuries. As they walked and talked, Iskerin felt the curse continue to tremble. Each hour Astrid spent in Norvengard, each memory she shared of what her grandmother had told her, each moment she existed as a living link between the frozen kingdom and the world that had forgotten it, weakened the magic that held them. By the time they returned to the palace, Iskerin could feel it clearly. The curse was failing. "It's you," he said to Astrid as they stood in the throne room. "You are the key." The prophecy spoke of a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. Your grandmother loved Norvengard so much that she kept its memory alive for 3 centuries, passing that love down through her family until it reached you. That's what the curse cannot withstand. Not power, not magic, but memory preserved through generations. Love that refuses to die. Astrid looked around the throne room with new understanding. Then what do we do? How do we finish breaking the curse? Iskerin walked to his throne and removed the crown from his head, the crown of ice and silver that had marked him as king for 3 centuries. He held it out to Astrid. The curse was designed to isolate Norvengard, to make the world forget. But you remembered. You came. You brought the outside world back to us. Now, we need to do the same in reverse. We need to bring Norvengard back to the world. He placed the crown in her hands. Take this beyond the border. Return to your home, to your people. Show them this crown. Tell them the story of Norvengard. Make them remember. When enough people in the outside world hold the memory of this kingdom in their hearts, when we exist in the collective consciousness of the world again, the curse will have no power. We will snap back into time, back into the world, as if we had never left. Astrid held the crown, feeling its weight, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. But that could take years, decades. How will you survive that much longer alone? "I have already survived 3 centuries, Iskerin said with a sad smile. "I can endure whatever time is necessary. Besides, I won't be truly alone anymore. Now I know someone remembers, someone cares. That changes everything." But Astrid shook her head. There has to be another way. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice. What if... She paused, thinking. What if the sacrifice is mine to make, not yours? You've already sacrificed everything. Maybe it's time someone sacrificed something for you. Before Iskerin could ask what she meant, Astrid closed her eyes and clasped the crown tightly. She began to speak in a language Iskerin didn't recognize at first, but then he realized it was Old Norvengardian, the ancient dialect that predated even Vormak I. His eyes widened as he understood. Senna had taught her family not just memories of Norvengard, but its language, its magic, its very essence. Astrid was working a spell, one that Iskerin quickly recognized as incredibly dangerous. She was offering herself as a bridge, using her life force to connect Norvengard to the outside world, to pull the kingdom back into the flow of time, by anchoring it to her own timeline. It was brilliant and terrible. It would work, but the strain might kill her. "Stop!" Iskerin commanded, rushing forward. You'll die." "I'm willing to risk it," Astrid said, her voice strained as power built around her. "My grandmother spent her whole life mourning what she had lost. She passed that grief down to my mother, to me. Let me turn that grief into something good. Let me be the one who brings Norvengard home." The magic swirled around them both now, visible as streams of light that flowed between Astrid and the very walls of the throne room. Iskaran could feel the curse shattering, breaking apart under the assault of this impossible spell, but he could also feel Astrid weakening, her life force being consumed by the working. Without thinking, acting on instinct and 3 centuries of mastered magic, Iskaran joined his power to hers. The Ice King reached out and took Astrid's hands, the crown held between their joined palms. He poured his own magic into the spell, adding his strength to hers, sharing the burden she had tried to take on alone. Together, their combined power surged through Norvengard, touching every frozen citizen, every stopped moment, every suspended second of the last 300 years. The curse broke with a sound like the world's largest mirror shattering. Time rushed back into Norvengard like a flood, and suddenly everything was moving again. In the marketplace, merchants completed sales that had been frozen mid-transaction. In homes throughout Crystal Haven, families finished conversations that had been interrupted 3 centuries ago. On the palace balcony, Elara and Freya gasped as time resumed, finding themselves looking at a city unchanged yet somehow different. And in the throne room, Iskaran and Astrid collapsed together, the spell complete, the curse broken, the cost paid. The Ice King looked up at the ceiling of his throne room and saw, for the first time in 300 years, dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles that moved and drifted, because time was flowing again, because change was possible again, because his kingdom had returned to the world. Beside him, Astrid breathed heavily but smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "Your people are free." Iskaran took her hand and helped her to her feet. Outside, he could hear sounds he had not heard in centuries. Voices raised in confusion and wonder, footsteps as people moved through the streets, the living sounds of the kingdom restored. He looked at Astrid, this impossible woman who had travelled across the world to remember what everyone else had forgotten, and he knew that whatever came next, Norvengard would face it, not alone, but as part of the world again, connected, remembered, and finally free. The forgotten Ice King of the North was forgotten no more, the forgotten phantom King of Angkor. The jungle had swallowed the truth whole, and for 700 years, nobody thought to ask what it was choking on. You stand in the archives of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in Siem Reap, holding a palm leaf manuscript that shouldn't exist. The edges crumble at your touch, releasing the smell of centuries, earth and incense and something else, something like burned sugar. The script is Old Khmer, the kind used in the 12th century, but the carbon dating says 1300, a gap of 100 years, an impossible gap. The manuscript mentions a name that appears nowhere else in the historical record. Terbuvanad Dyavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, a phantom. The official histories of Angkor are precise, almost obsessively so. They tell you that after the death of King Jayavarman VII in approximately 1220, the empire entered a period of decline. They tell you about his successors. Indravarman II, Jayavarman VIII, the gradual conversion to Theravada Buddhism, the slow fade of Angkorian glory. They tell you everything except this, that between 1221 and 1223, someone ruled who was systematically erased from every stone inscription, every royal chronicle, every temple wall. Someone the jungle remembers, even if history doesn't. The first clue came from the trees. A French botanist named Claudine Mercier was studying the growth rings of dipterocarp trees in the Angkor Archaeological Park when she noticed something odd. Several ancient specimens showed a pattern of accelerated growth during a 2-year period in the early 13th century, followed by sudden stress markers. Trees don't lie about climate. Something had changed in those years. A shift in water management, perhaps, or a dramatic alteration in the forest canopy. The irrigation systems told a similar story. Ground-penetrating radar revealed modifications to the Beret reservoirs that didn't match any known construction phase. Someone had re-engineered the hydraulic network of Angkor with extraordinary sophistication, then abandoned the work halfway through. The modifications used techniques that wouldn't appear in Khmer engineering for another 50 years. You trace the phantom through absence, through the spaces between documented reigns, through the archaeological shadows. The Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan visited Angkor in 1296 and described the customs of the Khmer court in meticulous detail, but he also mentioned something curious. The monks he spoke with referred to a period they called the Silent Years, a time when the temples fell quiet and the royal ceremonies ceased. They wouldn't explain further. Some silences, they said, were mandatory. The stone inscriptions are where the erasure becomes visible. At Taprom, you find a dedication stele from 1222 that's been partially recarved. The original text is still legible beneath the new layer if you know how to look. It speaks of a king who brought the waters to speak and made the stones remember their purpose. But then, chisel marks. Someone had taken great care to obliterate specific passages while leaving the rest intact. You take rubbings, photograph the angles of light across the damaged surfaces, and slowly, impossibly, a name emerges from the stone's memory. Tribhuvanadityavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, his reign left physical marks that couldn't be completely erased. At Preah Khan, hidden behind a later addition, you discover a small shrine with astronomical alignments that match no other structure in Angkor. The calculations are breathtaking in their precision. Someone had understood the precession of the equinoxes, had mapped the stars with mathematical accuracy that rivaled anything being done in Song Dynasty China. The shrine was built to capture sunlight on one specific day of the year, the 3rd of February, 1222. You check the Chinese astronomical records. On that date, a total solar eclipse passed directly over Angkor. The path of totality would have turned day to night for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A sun king who brought darkness at noon. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The Vietnamese annals provide an unexpected fragment. In 1222, they record a diplomatic mission to Angkor that returned in confusion. The embassy had been received by a king who wasn't the expected successor to Jayavarman VII. This king spoke in riddles, they reported, and had covered the palace mirrors with silk. He asked the Vietnamese envoys whether a reflection could rule a kingdom, and whether shadows had more substance than the things that cast them. The envoys concluded he was mad and terminated negotiations. But perhaps he wasn't mad. Perhaps he was asking a more profound question about the nature of power and legitimacy. You find his face in the least likely place, a minor temple called Krolko, dedicated to Jayavarman VII's royal guru. Tucked into a decorative panel, almost invisible unless you're looking for it, is a portrait carving unlike any other at Angkor. The style is wrong for the period, too naturalistic, too psychologically penetrating. The face belongs to a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with eyes that seem to look through stone rather than at the viewer, and there, in the tiny inscription beneath, the name again, Tribhuvanadityavarman. The few fragments of his story that survive suggest someone extraordinary. He appeared at court in 1220, claiming to be the son of Jayavarman VII by a concubine who had lived in the temple of Preah Khan. No one could verify the claim, but no one could disprove it either. He demonstrated knowledge of royal ritual that only someone raised in the palace could possess. He spoke 5 languages fluently, including Chinese and Cham. He could recite the entire Ramayana from memory, and he had ideas about how to save the empire. By 1220, Angkor was already in trouble, though the official inscriptions maintained the fiction of eternal glory. The hydraulic system that had sustained the city for 400 years was failing. Deforestation had destabilized the watersheds, the barais were silting up, the climate was shifting toward drought. The empire needed innovation, needed someone willing to break with tradition. Tribhuvanadityavarman proposed a radical restructuring of the water management system, based on principles he claimed to have learned from treatises brought from India. He wanted to implement a network of smaller, distributed reservoirs rather than relying on the massive royal barais. He wanted to introduce new rice cultivation techniques, new crops, new patterns of settlement. He wanted to reform the corvée labor system that was bleeding the countryside dry. The conservative faction at court was horrified. These proposals threatened the entire cosmological order that Angkorian kingship represented. The barais weren't just irrigation systems. They were replicas of the cosmic ocean. The temples weren't just monuments. They were the axis mundi, connecting earth to heaven. You couldn't simply reorganize them for efficiency. But Jayavarman VII was dying, and in his final months, he made a decision that would haunt the empire. He named Tribhuvanadityavarman as regent, giving him authority to implement his reforms on a trial basis. For 2 years, the Phantom King would have the chance to prove his vision. The archaeological record of those 2 years is thin but tantalizing. Construction began on 17 new reservoirs in a ring around Angkor. New canal systems were dug following principles of gradient and flow that were genuinely innovative. Agricultural experimental stations appeared in the countryside, testing drought-resistant crop varieties. The labourers conscripted for these projects were treated differently, paid in rice and cloth, rather than simply compelled, housed in better conditions, given days of rest. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The rice harvests of 1221 were the best in a generation. The new reservoirs held water through the dry season. The experimental crops proved viable. Tribhuvanadityavarman's reforms were succeeding, and that was precisely the problem. The Brahmin priests, who legitimized royal power through their mastery of Sanskrit ritual, found themselves sidelined. The great families who controlled the temple estates saw their influence waning. The generals who had built careers on conquest watched resources redirected to irrigation and agriculture. The Phantom King had accumulated too many enemies too quickly, and he had failed to understand the most important rule of Angkorian politics. Power wasn't about effectiveness, it was about performance. When Jayavarman VII finally died in late 1221, the conservative faction moved quickly. They installed Indravarman II, a royal cousin who represented continuity and tradition. Tribhuvanadityavarman refused to cede power. He claimed that Jayavarman had recognized him as a true son in a deathbed declaration. He argued that his reforms were succeeding and deserved more time. He made the fatal mistake of believing that results mattered more than legitimacy. The civil war that followed lasted less than 6 months, but it was vicious enough to scar the empire permanently. Tribhuvanadityavarman held Angkor Thom itself, along with several major temples. Indravarman controlled the countryside and the loyalty of most provincial governors. The conflict wasn't fought with massive armies. The empire was already too depleted for that. Instead, it was a war of sieges and skirmishes, of water supplies cut off and food stores blockaded, of temples fortified and populations starved. In May of 1222, during the eclipse he had calculated so precisely, Tribhuvanadityavarman attempted a final gambit. He staged an elaborate ceremony at the Bayon, claiming that the darkened sun proved his divine mandate. If the gods had not favoured him, he proclaimed, they would not have written his legitimacy across the sky. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the world turned dark in the middle of the day. In that darkness, he declared himself sole legitimate king. It was a magnificent piece of theatre, but it changed nothing. Indravarman's forces breached Angkor Thom's defences 2 weeks later, and Tribhuvanadityavarman vanished into the jungle with a handful of loyal followers. What happened next is the strangest part of the story. Most failed pretenders to the Khmer throne were executed publicly, their deaths inscribed on temple walls as warnings. But there's no record of Tribhuvanadityavarman's death, no triumphant inscription celebrating his defeat, no description of his punishment. Instead, there's a systematic erasure that required time, effort, and coordination. Every inscription bearing his name was recarved. Every temple dedication was modified. Every official document was destroyed or amended. The new reservoirs he had built were attributed to earlier kings or left anonymous. His reforms were quietly maintained. They worked too well to abandon, but credit for them vanished into the administrative record. It was as if the empire had decided that the Phantom King was more dangerous as a martyr than as a forgotten footnote. By erasing him completely, they denied him even the dignity of defeat. But erasure is never complete. The jungle keeps its own records. In 1223, a small temple was constructed deep in the forest, far from Angkor's administrative center. It's called Bantai Chmar, though that's not its original name. The structure is modest by Angkorian standards, but the inscriptions are peculiar. They speak of a king who walked among the stones like a shadow, and whose name was Silence. They describe someone who had rejected worldly power to seek a different kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of understanding, of seeing the empire's problems with clarity, even if he couldn't solve them. Some scholars think Tribhuvanadityavarman lived out his days at this temple, protected by monks who still believed in his vision. Others suggest he died in the jungle during the rainy season of 1223, just another casualty of the Civil War's aftermath. The Vietnamese annals mention rumors of a Khmer prince living in exile in Champa, teaching astronomy and hydraulic engineering, but they never name him. You prefer to think he survived, at least for a while. The evidence is circumstantial, a pattern of temple construction in remote areas over the next decade that uses his innovative techniques, a series of inscriptions that seem to quote his ideas without attribution, the spread of his agricultural reforms despite official silence about their origin. It's as if his vision outlived his political existence, propagating itself through the empire like seeds scattered on the wind. The supreme irony is that many of Tribhuvanadityavarman's reforms became standard practice within a generation. The distributed reservoir system he proposed was gradually implemented. The agricultural innovations were adopted. The labor practices were modified in the direction he had advocated. The empire absorbed his ideas even as it erased his name, like a body rejecting a transplanted organ while somehow integrating its function. By the time Zhou de Guan visited Angkor in 1296, the silent years had become a kind of parable. The monks told him that there had once been a king who tried to change too much too quickly, who had forgotten that empires move like trees rather than like water. Fast growth, they said, produces weak wood. The forest knows to grow slowly, to add each ring patiently, to respect the wisdom of gradual change. But you wonder if they were right. Standing in the ruins of Angkor now, with the jungle reclaiming the stones and the berets turned to swamps, you can't help but think that perhaps Tribhuvanadityavarman's great failure was also his greatest insight. He understood that the empire was dying, that the old cosmological certainties couldn't sustain a civilization facing climate change and resource depletion. He tried to adapt, to innovate, to imagine a different kind of Khmer greatness. And for that vision, he was erased. The palm leaf manuscript you're holding contains what might be his only surviving words, written in his own hand or copied by someone who knew him. The script is elegant, the reasoning clear. He writes about water as if it were a living teacher, about rice as if it contained the secrets of governance, about the relationship between rulers and ruled as a kind of mutual responsibility rather than cosmic hierarchy. It's radical stuff for the 13th century, ideas that wouldn't become common for another 500 years. On the final page, there's a statement that might be his epitaph. A king who cannot be forgotten has failed, for he has made himself more important than his kingdom. Better to be the rain that falls in darkness, unnamed but necessary, than the sun that burns so bright it leaves only desert behind. The phantom king of Angkor understood something that the official histories still haven't grasped. Greatness isn't always written in stone. Sometimes it's written in the patterns of water flowing through carefully engineered channels, in rice growing in drought-resistant varieties, in the small daily miracles of a system that works even after everyone's forgotten who designed it. You carefully return the manuscript to its climate-controlled case, aware that you're handling something that maybe a dozen people have read in 700 years. Outside, the sun is setting over the ruins of the Bayon, turning the stone faces gold and crimson. In this light, you can almost see him, a young man standing at the center of the world, calculating eclipses and water flow, trying to save an empire that didn't want to be saved. The jungle has swallowed most of the evidence, but here and there, if you know where to look, the Phantom King still haunts the stones. His reservoirs still hold water in the right season. His canal systems still follow the contours of the land with elegant efficiency. His ideas still whisper through the archives, anonymous but persistent. History remembers the kings who built the tallest temples, who conquered the most territory, who inscribed their names largest on the surviving stones. But the jungle remembers something else. It remembers the king who understood that water matters more than monuments, that systems outlast personalities, that the greatest power might be the power to disappear while leaving the world slightly better than you found it. Trivuvanaditya, the Sun King of 3 worlds, the Phantom King of Angkor, he ruled for 2 years and has been forgotten for 700. But his vision remains, encoded in the landscape like a message written in a language the stones are still learning to read. And perhaps that's the only kind of immortality worth having. Not to be remembered, but to have mattered. Not to echo through the ages, but to change them in ways too subtle for history to notice. The eclipse he calculated so carefully passed into darkness and returned to light, as all eclipses do. But the shadow it cast is still there, if you know how to see it. Still there in the water flowing through channels he designed, in the rice growing in fields his reforms made possible, in the slow, patient work of trying to imagine a better world, even when the world isn't ready to listen. That's the story the jungle tells in the language of roots and stone and water. The story of the king who was never there, whose reign was a dream the empire tried to forget, whose greatest achievement was to disappear so completely that his ideas could survive without him. The forgotten Phantom King of Angkor, whose absence speaks louder than any inscription.